All right, so hi, my name is Adam Harris, and I have the pleasure of moderating the final panel for this afternoon on corporate social responsibility. And we'll be talking about mostly voluntary codes. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists, and we'll get started with the session. All right, so first off, we have Yolanda Banks. She's the Senior Corporate Social Responsibility Advisor at Export Development Canada. Her primary responsibilities include management of stakeholder relations with non-governmental organizations, as well as coordination of the championing corporate social responsibility practices within the corporation. She serves on the Management Advisory Board of the Canadian Business Ethics Research Network and was previously a member of Canada's delegation to the International Standards Organization Working Group on Corporate Social Responsibility. Second, we have Mr. Ramsey Hart. He joined Mining Watch Canada as the Canada Program Coordinator in 2008. In this position, he works with communities concerned with proposed mining projects, reviews environmental assessment, develops proposals and advocates for the legal reform, and provides critical analysis to the media, concerned citizens, and political decision makers. And finally, we have joining us via Skype, Mr. Stuart Leith. He's Assistant Vice President, Environment and Corporate Affairs, and Senior Counsel for Smithfield Foods. He oversees federal and state regulatory compliance programs for the company and its subsidiaries, and coordinates and manages Smithfield Foods' sustainability programs, encompassing environmental performance, animal care, worker safety, food safety, and community development, as well as related external communications. So please join me in welcoming our panelists for this afternoon. All right, so we're going to use a little bit of different structure for this afternoon's final panel. Hopefully we'll keep everyone a little more engaged before we head off to the pub for our final event of the day. And I just want to check, Stuart, how are the sound levels with you?
Sounds great, and greetings from Virginia. So I'm sorry I'm there not in person, but I can hear you guys great.
Okay, perfect. So we're good to start then. All right, so my first question for the panel is, I guess, could you tell us a little bit about the area you work in and how you act with voluntary codes? And I guess you could also give us your perspective on what a voluntary code is. So I guess we'll start with Yolanda.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam, and thanks for inviting Export Development Canada to be represented today. I'll just repeat a bit of how the things in my bio. I'm the Senior Advisor of Corporate Social Responsibility at EDC, and basically how we interface with voluntary codes is we are a signatory to something called the Equator Principles, and so that's an agreement between over 70 banks, about 75, that establish that they will use another standard, an international standard, for evaluating environmental and social performance on large infrastructure projects that we might finance. So that's how I'm involved mostly with a voluntary code. I find that very often we are raising the bar in terms of performance, environmental performance, by using this agreement that all of these banks have signed up to. The other codes, though, that I am involved with is the Global Reporting Initiative. It's not a code, but it is a voluntary standard that a lot of corporations adhere to. Also, the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights is another key one, and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So those codes all filter into a lot of the work that I do. The value, your other question was, what is a voluntary code? So sometimes when we define what is a voluntary code, it's easier to say what it's not. So it's not a law. It's something that you agree to its principles and how you implement it just because you think it's something that your corporation should undertake. And usually you're operating in a community of like-minded corporations or institutions that want to, as well, sign up to the same principles. So that's a voluntary code. If I may, if I could just explain what Export Development Canada is, because a lot of people hear the name EDC but don't quite know what we do. So we're a corporation. We're owned by the Government of Canada, but we operate like a private sector entity. We're a financial institution, and what we do is provide financing and insurance in support of Canada's export trade and the Canadian investment abroad. And in the U.S. context, a combination of EXIM and OPIC are our equivalents.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ramsey, if you'd like to go next.
Sure, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for sticking it out to the end. We'll get you to the pub soon, I'm sure. So Mining Watch Canada is Canada's only national organization focused exclusively on the mining sector, and we work both domestically here in Canada, and that's my focus as Canada Program Coordinator. But we also follow Canadian mining companies where they operate overseas, which is pretty much everywhere in the world, except maybe Antarctica. And so within the mining sector, there's a real mushrooming of CSR and voluntary initiatives, which, as Yolanda explained, are standards and expectations which are primarily voluntary or entirely voluntary by definition, that companies sign on to or lending agencies sign on to in order to try and ramp up the performance from a social and environmental perspective. And Mining Watch, our general sense of these codes and standards is that they're interesting, they provide some benefit, and we'll get into that a bit more later, but that they're largely insufficient. So we would actually rather see laws put in place than voluntary codes. And I can elaborate on that more later. And despite that sort of skepticism or concern around the space that CSR is taking up and displacing discussion around mandatory regulatory changes, we do engage on some of these voluntary codes. Notably, my coworker, Catherine Coumans, was quite involved in putting input into a UN process on business and human rights that was led by John Ruggie, that has come out with the guiding principles on business and human rights. And we're quite engaged in that process. And Catherine is also an active member of a standard-setting body called the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. The acronym is IRMA. And that is an effort to try and establish a auditable standard for responsible mining that would be somewhat akin to Forest Stewardship Council certification that exists currently for forestry.
Okay, great, thanks. And Stuart.
Yes, good afternoon again, and thank you for letting me join by Skype. I couldn't get there in time, so I'm glad to at least participate with you today, and I can see you through the cam, so it's nice to see everybody. Let me first answer how we utilize codes, and my company uses them quite a bit, quite frankly, by giving you a little bit of perspective. And if Adam, you could shift, I've got a couple slides just to help with this. If you could shift to the first slide that says food company, Adam.
All right, 1 second. Okay, perfect.
All right, well, Smithfield, just to let you know who we are, we started out about 75 years ago as a very small meat processor in a tidewater area of Virginia. And we've grown over the years since we first opened, and now we're actually the largest of what we do. We're the largest pork producer in the world, the largest pork processor in the world, and the largest packaged pork producer in the United States, as well as in Europe. And we own about and operate about 460 hog farms throughout the United States and in Europe and in Mexico, and we contract with about 2,100 independent farmers to grow our animals, and we have about 50 or so different facilities around the United States where we do everything from making feed to processing meat. So that's basically our footprint. And if you could shift to the next slide there, Adam. Smithfield itself, we don't have a huge national or global brand like a Coca-Cola or a Kraft. Instead, we've grown through acquisition, and we have a number of regional brands. The Smithfield company itself is well known in the eastern part of the United States, but not so much as you go west. And so companies like Farmland and Armour and Eckrich, which we acquired over time, are much better known. In Canada, I believe we export Smithfield brands and Cook brands and some Armour and Eckrich products. I'm not sure if you all have seen those products in the stores. But our main customers are large groceries and restaurant chains and food service chains. And I think there was someone told me that we probably produce about 78% of the bacon that's eaten in North America. So that's kind of who we are. And it's important to understand, I guess, in the use of our codes, sort of where we came from and our journey to sustainability. If you go to the next slide, Adam, where it says where our journey began.
Yes.
You see a picture of some hogs on a barn there on the right. Smithfield in the 1990s was not very well respected in the environmental community, not in so much in terms of the activists or the government. In fact, I know that firsthand. I was with the government in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I was an environmental lawyer for the state, and I actually sued my company. And if you scroll down there and you see a case law, it says Tracy versus Commonwealth, or excuse me, Tracy versus Smithfield. Dennis Tracy is actually Smithfield's chief sustainability officer now. At the time, he was the agency head for the Department of Environmental Quality in Virginia, and also sued Smithfield. So we had a bad image back then, and we had bad things happen to us. We had spills from our processing plants. We were prosecuted by the state and federal government, but the company officials knew that we had to change. We became a large company over a very quick period of time, and we realized we had to change. And so and this is where the codes come in. Let me get Adam to go to the next slide.
All right.
It should say Smithfield Sustainability Program.
Yep.
A little over a decade ago, Dennis Tracy was hired onto and this is before I even got to the company, to start to change things and the way the corporate structure dealt with environmental programs. And we utilized, if you look at each one of those icons, our sustainability program today is comprised of these 5 major facets you see there. The environmental facet, we have animal care and food safety and employee safety, and our community and philanthropic efforts. And we've added something called value creation just last year. It all started with the environmental program on the left. And I can't obviously go through each one of these prongs, but we utilized at the very beginning the ISO standard, the ISO 14001 standard as the model for our EMS. And we set about to get certified all of our farms and all of our plants under that system. And we achieved that, actually had all 400, at the time, it was probably 450 farms certified in 2002, followed by all of our processing plants in 2004, starting with our largest one in North Carolina, which has about 5,000 people working there. It's a huge facility. And so we utilized those codes on the environmental side as the model for that new program. We did a number of other things in addition to that, but that became part and parcel of how we got a handle on and improved our environmental situation. So that's how we have utilized codes, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, I guess, as the questions go on. But we've utilized and have, from the lessons learned of the ISO program, actually utilized those codes in each one of our major facets for our sustainability program. That's it for me, Adam, for this question.
And we'll try to get you back up here. All right, perfect. So I think we'll have some really interesting discussions around the topic of voluntary codes, especially with 3 very unique perspectives from the private sector and from the NGO perspective, and also some quasi-government, I guess you could say, as well. So we'll keep on going with the questions. My next thought is along the lines of, so we've heard a little bit about how each of you work with voluntary codes, and maybe you could weigh in, I'm sure we could guess your answer, the benefits and or disadvantages of this type of sustainability driver. I think everyone here is interested in protecting or improving the environment, so interested in hearing how voluntary codes might interact or drive some of those initiatives or fall short of that. So I guess, Ramsey, if you'd like to start this one.
So I think these kinds of voluntary codes can help create space on the progressive edge of change. And so leaders can sign up for these codes, demonstrate that they can do better than others in the field, and help shift sort of the collective momentum on issues, whether it be climate change or human rights or waste management. And that is a good thing. But what it can't do and what it won't do is ask some of the tougher questions. What we're going to be limiting ourselves to with an emphasis on voluntary approaches is practices that are, within the realm of the art of the possible, or that are acceptable to industrial stakeholders, as opposed to perhaps things that society outside of the industrial stakeholder might think are important or really priority objectives. And so we do tend to then limit ourselves to fairly modest incremental changes as opposed to more substantive shifts. We're not going to end up asking whether a mine should be somewhere or not, or whether we should have factory pork farms or not. We'll be asking ourselves, what will the side benefits of a mine be? Or how will we best manage the waste from an industrial agricultural operation? So we are going to really constrain our discussion with an emphasis on CSR. And I think if we recognize that, that is okay, but we need to make sure that we have a space for those other discussions, the more fundamental discussions, to take place as well. And my big concern is that the CSR space is elbowing out discussions about other changes, regulated changes that are needed to address really very serious issues. And in Mining Watch, just to give you a flavor for some of the kinds of issues we're dealing with, it's not just sort of small things. We're talking about rapes of women at mine sites in Guatemala and Papua New Guinea. We're talking about assassinations of mining activists. We're talking about water systems that are contaminated potentially over hundreds of years. So these aren't little sort of small issues that we can deal with by coming up with, glossy brochures and a few indicators. These are really, really serious things that we, in Mining Watch's opinion, we really need to have a more regulatory and mandatory approach to, because ultimately a voluntary principle is just that. It's only companies that wish to sign up for it that are going to sign up. And even within Canada, we have the Mining Association of Canada's Towards Sustainable Mining Initiative, which is sort of a leading standard for mining, but only half of the companies that operate mines in Canada are members of the Mining Association of Canada. So that leaves the other half that aren't applying those standards, in which case we need very strict and strong regulatory regimes in order to manage those other companies.
Okay, great, thank you. And another perspective, we'll have maybe Stuart go next.
Sure. I agree that a voluntary code by itself is insufficient. I mean, from my perspective, and as a former regulator and lawyer for the government, I kind of think about things from the standpoint of a holistic approach. We have, and I know Canada is the same way, a command and control regulatory structure that's been in place for decades. For many companies, that's the floor, and for many reputable companies, you have to meet those standards as just to do business. That is the minimum. These voluntary standards take you to a higher, more continuous improvement, in my view, a role, but they also have to be part of a holistic thing. For example, I talked about the ISO program that we adopted at Smithfield. We also adopted other things. We have an environmental awards program. We have training. We adopted metrics and internal reporting systems. We changed the whole structure of our company and reporting up through to the CEO on environmental matters. So, and in many companies, this kind of thing has to come from the top. So I do agree with the comment that they are insufficient by themselves, but I think that they're very, very important in driving toward continuous improvement at a company.
Okay, great, thank you. And Yolanda?
I think many of the points have already been made, but what I would add is that a voluntary standard that's worth its salt, let me put it that way, isn't developed only with industrial stakeholders. So typically you'll find that a voluntary standard is really put through a rigorous multi-stakeholder process when it's developed and when it's revised. And it's not just perhaps the voice of industry that's reflected in the voluntary standard or the voluntary code. Like Stuart, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not one or the other. It's not a legal framework or a voluntary code. They both really have to work together to raise overall corporate performance for better outcomes for the environment, for society in general. The voluntary code that I was referring to that we work with is worldwide, and if we were to rely only on legislation, what it would mean is in every country you would have to have a set of laws addressing this issues of environmental impacts, social impacts, and inevitably what the consequence would be an uneven playing field, because you would have, the laws would be different in every country that decided to pass them. So what the voluntary approach does, it gets everybody on a level playing field in terms of how they're going to develop large projects abroad. So the voluntary process really, I think, helps companies exceed what the law requires, with the law being the minimum, the base from which you have to build. I think I'll just pick up on a point that Stuart made. Any company signing up to a voluntary code isn't doing so because they just want window dressing. Most companies are very aware that they can be sued for non-compliance, and voluntary codes can be, it hasn't been tested a lot in the courts. You can be sued for, I would say, not false advertising. And the case I point to is Mark Caskey versus Nike in approximately 2002. And it went to the California Supreme Court, was eventually turned back, and the two parties settled out of court. But Mark Caskey is a social activist who sued Nike based on their CSR report. And he said that the CSR report basically was false advertising because the company hadn't lived up to the claims in its report. So for a while, that put quite a chill on CSR reporting. Companies weren't really anxious to put out reports for fear that they might be sued. But what companies do is they continue to report out on these things, and they're very careful that they not say things or claim they adhere to codes that they absolutely cannot live up to.
Okay, great, thank you. So some very interesting perspectives on the benefits or disadvantages, and I think maybe as a room full of lawyers and law students, it'd be very interesting to talk about how voluntary codes interact with the legal regime, so the different regulatory or legal regime that might exist, or as you already mentioned, in the courts. So I forgot the order we're going in, but yeah, we'll start with Stuart first this time.
Sure. You know, in my experience, and I don't mean to say this is the way it goes through for all industries and all codes, but in my experience, the use of these voluntary codes like the ISO program, or in our case, we use for worker safety, we modeled the OSA and the American Standard Z10. And others. The benefit, in addition to helping with the management of and the structure of the company, is being able to, when you're interacting with regulatory officials, with elected officials, to be able to demonstrate that you actually have those programs and that they work, and that they've improved your own internal structure. We can show, for example, that our farms, for example, in the United States, have gone from having NOVs 10 years ago, 50 or 60 NOVs a year for different types of violations, down to zero. The last 30 months, we had a single notice of violation on any farm anywhere in the United States or in Mexico. And so we can use that to show and interact with our regulatory officials to demonstrate that, you know, our heart's in the right place and we're actually trying to improve things above and beyond their regulatory structure. So when a mistake does happen, and you know, I have 46,000 employees, somewhere in the world, someone's doing something very stupid right now, I think. And so I might find myself, you know, having to deal with somebody, but it provides a framework of credibility, I think, that I appreciated when I was in the government, and I think that echoes with legislators and officials that are appointed in the regulatory context as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Yolanda, would you like to go?
Just on the interface between codes and the legal framework, what we do at EDC is we will embed a code or the requirements of a voluntary standard into a legal contract, into a loan contract. So when we make a loan to what's called a project sponsor to develop a large infrastructure project, could be a mining project, oil and gas, could be a subway in another country. What we'll do is say you have to adhere to the following standards, and the code I'm referring to is based on some guidelines developed by the private sector lending arm of the World Bank. So you can have a legal compliance requirement that's built around a voluntary code. So the two don't necessarily have to be quite distinct and standalone.
If one could sue mining companies for misleading statements made in their corporate social responsibility reports, we might have a virtual gold mine on our hands. I've reviewed several of them, and it's not uncommon for me to find statements like one in a 2011 Potash Corps report that said they know of no, I have the exact quote in a slide deck I prepared, but we're not using it, but it's something along the lines, we're not aware of having committed any problems or negative social impacts in the communities where we operate in 2011. I know there's a few Maritimers down here, and I don't know if you know about the situation of Penobscot, New Brunswick, but that community has lost 60 drinking water wells immediately over top of the underground workings of the Potash Corps mine near Sussex. There's really no other explanation for the loss of those drinking water wells other than the underground mine workings. And yet Potash Corps can put in its CSR statements that it knows of no negative effects it's had on communities. So I have a real concern around the reporting and the accuracy of I'm not going to dispute, the tons of carbon and things like that they report, but when broad general statements about impacts are made like that, and when you scratch the surface a little bit, it's often, you can find discrepancies, shall we say. The other real concern I have around, excuse me, the interface of law and voluntary codes is exactly this tension between mandatory versus voluntary. And if I saw our legal regime advancing and growing at the same pace as the voluntary initiatives, I would feel much better about things, and I wouldn't sort of get jittery when I hear about voluntary codes. But I do get jittery, and the reason I get jittery is because we're seeing a retraction of our laws and an expansion of voluntary codes, and efforts to implement law thwarted by examples of voluntary codes that are used to say we don't need a regulation because the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada has E3+, which is a code that's really good and we'll all follow it. And that is what the industry argues. A really good example of this was our and many other organizations' efforts to get a very modest bill passed through Parliament called Bill C-300, which would start to put some restrictions on government support of Canadian mining companies operating internationally. There would have been legal requirements for Canadian companies receiving government aid to follow prescribed standards, so it would have been binding. It wouldn't have necessarily controlled all corporate activities, but just their interactions with the Canadian government. This bill had broad support across social justice circles, faith groups, international solidarity groups, and international development groups. It ran up against a very, very well-funded and fierce lobby from the mining industry. They pulled out all the stops and started, accusing us of trying to kill jobs in Canada. Still haven't quite made that connection in my head between what we were proposing and how it would affect jobs in the Yukon. But that was the arguments that were put forward. And the bill didn't pass by 6 votes. The government's response to this private members bill, it was during the minority government, was to bring out a entirely voluntary corporate social responsibility platform. I don't really have the time to get into all the details of it, but it's got 4 pillars and a few other things have been added on to it as well. We've got sort of fairly extensive critiques about it, but it's all voluntary based, and just as one example, it created a corporate social responsibility counselor that would advise and counsel companies that were running into problems. But in order for that counselor to do anything, they had to have the buy-in of the company in a process. And so one of the complaints that was brought against a Canadian company in Mexico, the company refused to cooperate, so that ended the process.
All right. So I provided the questions before, but I believe we've really touched on number 4. So if there's no objections, I think for the sake of time, we'll move on to the final question, unless anyone had any specific comments they wanted to say about. But I believe we've touched on that a little bit. So my final question I would just like to pose to the panel is what improvements could be made to voluntary codes, or speaking broadly about other areas of corporate social responsibility in general? And I'll let Yolanda start with this one.
I love the question, Adam, because I'm a CSR advisor, and I think voluntary codes really can raise standards of behavior and performance for reasons that Ramsey was pointing out. Laws can take a very long time to pass. Once passed, a very large budget to enforce. Usually they don't capture much behavior. It's often something of a threat, but it's only applied if you get caught having broken it. Voluntary codes, some similar arguments could be applied, and where I think voluntary codes have a bit of the edge is they're more flexible, can be revised more readily, but where they fall down is, I think, on the discipline of consistent compliance across all of the companies that say they adhere to them. And one recommendation that I think would really help, at least in the area that I work with, the Equator Principles and the IFC performance standards, is if there were an independent review of the financial institutions that sign up to them, just to see how everyone is implementing the standard or the code. Is it done equally across institutions? How all the devil is in the detail. So how are they interpreting things like the guidance on how you resettle populations when you're building a mine? Are financial institutions asking the right questions of these mining companies? So I think that you have to have some type of peer review process to instill that discipline across the adherence to any given code. I know that in Canada, another voluntary standard that I work with is out of the OECD. It's called the Action Statement on Bribery, and it's a statement that export credit agencies like EDC have signed up to, and they have a peer review process, and I would argue that that peer review process is what brought Canada to amend or propose an amendment to its corruption of foreign public officials legislation, which is before Parliament now. And the peer review can be a very embarrassing process. You know that Canada was quite criticized coming out of that, and it is a way of making sure that anyone adhering to a voluntary standard really does meet the principles behind it, and that everyone is working on a level playing field. I think a review process also would address the issue of free ridership. For some codes that aren't based in any type of compliance regime, a lot of companies sign up and that's the end of it. It's window dressing. They put it on their website, it's in some of their annual reports, they use the code logo, and there really isn't anything meaningful behind it in terms of the company's behavior. One example I know with the Global Compact, the UN Global Compact, it's a CSR standard, 10 principles covering everything from environment to corruption. They had been really accused of allowing too many free riders. So they implemented a process about 5 years ago where they began to delist or get rid of companies that were just using their standard for window dressing. And they now ask that companies report to them on how every year, it's called, oh, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the compliance document you have to file with them to show that you really are compliant with the 10 principles that code, that Global Compact sets out. So for voluntary codes, I really do believe there is a measure of improvement in terms of discipline and peer review to see that the code is being met.
Great. And Ramsey, if you'd like to go second.
Sure. Totally agree with Yolanda's recommendations in terms of peer review or some sort of an auditing process for any kind of voluntary code. That does exist for some of them, like Max Towards Sustainable Mining does have a auditing component built into it. The reason we're engaged with the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance and not other things like Max initiative is because within the development of that, we feel like we are equal partners in that. Like MAC has an advisory body which gives them input into their standards, but ultimately the industry association has control over what comes out of it. Whereas the IRMA standard is really being developed in a collaborative fashion. And so more initiatives like that where there is thanks to Sophie for finally explaining to me what agency is all about in the talk she gave. I keep hearing the word, and it was never really quite clear what it meant. But where the NGOs or civil society actually has some agency in the process. In other words, they have some power to affect the outcome as opposed to just making comments and having input. Another area where I'd like to see some changes is where there are it's a tricky thing to do, but because of the diversity of operations that a standard may cover. But if we could move away from standards that require a company to have a plan, there's a lot of standards that say you should have a plan for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Well, it's nice if you have a plan, but many of us would like to see something a little stronger or see some real reductions, or you have to have tailings management plan for the Mining Association standards. Well, a plan's good, but let's really look at what the actual impacts are and trying to reduce those. So that's another area that where we could improve them. And to wrap up my sort of general conclusion about voluntary codes, what we also need is to be realistic about them and to include them along with evolution and development of really good, strong, mandatory regulations and mandatory law that will raise the bar for everybody, not just those who choose to lead.
Okay, great. And Stuart?
I agree. I'll just wrap up with a couple last points. And I certainly agree with the consistency issue. And I'll just illustrate that in terms of, as an example, our annual report, our CSR report is now integrated with our financial report. We're a publicly held company. And we use the GRI standard, which many of you may be familiar with, to try to grade that report. And we are, Dennis and I are very sensitive about greenwashing and not saying anything more than what is absolutely true and accurate. And so we have graded and obtained a B-level grade on GRI. And we see others getting GRI ratings at different levels, and we kind of scratch our heads because we understand those companies and realize they don't have some of the same things we do. So we're trying to figure out, how two companies that have markedly different programs can get different grades on the same thing. So consistency is a big thing, and I'll flip it around too. The sustainability world, there's debate after debate about what sustainability means, and I've been through conferences where the entire conference was about what does that mean? People, planet, profit, or what? How do you define it? And we don't try to define it. But what we find is that a lot of companies out there, there are dozens of them that are actually rating companies on sustainability, and they're all completely inconsistent. No one is the same. I mean, I just finished answering some questions for a research group that does the research for FTSE for Good, the Social Responsible Index. And that index and research group is completely different from the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and the company that does that ratings for companies for that index. So there's a lot of inconsistencies and across the board. So I think it would be helpful, frankly, if we could have consistency not only in the use within the company of the code, but also on the other side and what's important and what's not.
Okay, great. And I'll just open it up to all the panelists if they have any final thoughts or conclusions before we open it up to the audience for question and answer as well. So I'm not sure if
we'll continue our little rotation here. I guess
it keeps me. It's easier for me if we continue.
So I would say, as a final concluding remark, it would be impossible to have a law for every desired corporate behavior that you could get social agreement on, which would be very difficult to achieve in the first place. So I think there is a role in that environment for voluntary codes, but the ultimate question becomes, what's the judicious mix or the optimal mix of codes versus law? And so as students of environmental law, that's something I think that it deserves a lot of thought, it merits a lot of deliberation and consideration on your part as you go into careers in environmental law, whether as corporate counsel with corporations like EDC or Smithfield, or on your own ticket in independent practice. And do we have enough of each, and when do we have too much of one or the other? So thank you.
I think I wrapped up in my last comments. I'm not sure I have anything new to add. I'd welcome your questions and discussion. And this is just one area of Mining Watch's work. And if you're interested in learning more about us, by all means, get in touch. And we've got a pretty extensive website. Certainly you heard about mining and environmental assessment earlier, and that's a big part of our work as well. But best of luck in your initiatives and endeavors, and I really hope this conference really is the first of many more, and congratulations on initiating a really important student association. Thanks to the Elder for your work welcoming this morning, and thanks to everybody for being here.
Great, thank you, and Stuart.
Well, I'll just say this. If you are interested in any of the programs I talked about, we don't think that there are any secrets in the world anymore in terms of what corporations and governments do. Transparency is key for us, and if you're interested in any things that we do, go to www.smithfieldfoods or smithfieldcommitments.com, and I'd welcome you to look at our integrated report, and I would be happy to talk to any of you all about our programs and delve further into it. I'm actually interested in any questions you have as well. So thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. And just a huge thank you to all our panelists. It was absolutely fantastic, and from my perspective, extremely interesting to hear all of your thoughts on this topic. So if everyone would like to join me in thanking the panelists. And I think we still have a few minutes if people from the audience would like to pose any questions as well.
Question really to our U.S. representative, and very interested in all the codes, and I think you alluded to it with the transparency, but what's the consequence of not following a code in the company? I know we've got a line. I just wanted to say, at one extreme you could say no consequence, it's voluntary, and the other is, well, the board of directors is going to be after you and they'll want to know every instance of non-compliance. You could say that's still voluntary, but there's quite a mix, quite a range in there of accountability. So where would you fit on that spectrum? Do the codes make their way all the way up to the board? Is it that level, or is there a whole variety of things between?
They do actually. It's actually, you know, if a plant actually decided not to be ISO certified, that's not been tested. but I tell you, we do have the attention of our board of directors. We have actually a sustainability committee made up of independent directors of our board. We have a committee in our C-suite, and our most executives at the company have a sustainability committee. All of these programs I talked about come up through them, and they are reported on a regular basis at our quarterly board meetings. And there's a great deal of interest in here on these programs. And it's important also to our customers. And I mentioned at the very beginning, our customers are not, the individuals are sitting in the room maybe buying our products, but our customers are large corporations, the Walmarts and the Costco's and the McDonald's of the world. And sustainability is actually very, very important in the global supply chain to these companies. And so there are ramifications there as well. So we take it very seriously. We've never actually had a situation where someone decided they weren't going to do it because it's just a given that they are going to do it. It sounds almost too good to be true, but that's kind of the way it is right now in our company.
Okay, great question. Thank you. Is there anyone else? All right, I guess everyone's got all the information they need for a Saturday afternoon. So once again, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to all our panelists, and I'll invite, I guess, the chairs to come up and say some closing remarks. Thank you.